Well, hello there. Welcome to the Soil and Roots podcast, where we journey together into deep discipleship. I'm Brian Fisher, and this is episode 144. We are knee-deep in season 7 of the Soil and Roots podcast. This season is called Deep Calls to Deep, and we're exploring rather gently and slowly, how do we become deep disciples? How do we become people who increasingly think and relate and act and love like Jesus over time? And I hope you're enjoying the season so far. Typically in the middle of seasons, we take a bit of a break every now and then to give you a few bonus episodes, and today is one of those times. So I hope you enjoy it. And I am going off script. Literally, this is one of those few occasions, might be the only occasion, where we're not working from some sort of framework. I have taken some notes, but really what I wanted to do today was just share where Soil and Roots is and a little bit of our story and where we're going. So this is very much a different type of episode. Every other episode, I think, is evergreen, meaning I try to write and provide material to you with Tim and Kyle that you can listen to 10 years from now, 50 years from now, and it's going to be just as enriching. But I really felt it was time, since so many of you have stayed with us. We're in our 4th to 5th year now of the podcast, of how we got here, how Soil and Roots came to be, and what we're doing this summer. It's a really pivotal time for the organization and what it means for us going forward. So it's like Friday morning story time in elementary school. And so I'm not working off of a script. I usually write the episodes so that I stay on target and it sounds hopefully conversational. But I'm just going to share with you from the heart in a kind of a raw way. And so I'm breaking this down into 4 sections. So the first section is sort of a 5-year personal history for Jessica and I, and how that relates to the Soil and Roots story. And I just hope that'll be helpful to you and you might resonate with some of that. The second section is the Soil and Roots story over the last 5 years and some of the underpinnings and what we've discovered about Jesus and about the world and about discipleship. And the third section, I'm going to share specifically what we're doing this summer. It's kind of a transitional time for us. And then the fourth section is, what does Soil and Roots look like as we head into the fall? This is June of 2026 when I'm recording this. So I'm super excited to share this with you. We are going to take longer music breaks in between these 4 sections. I've asked Zach to maybe give us 20 or 30 seconds, maybe 40 seconds of music in case you want to pause the episode and come back, or just take a mental break as we move from section to section. Okay, so the point here is, what has God been doing through and in Soil and Roots and through me personally over these last 5 years, and how might it relate to you and your spiritual journey? So today, instead of giving you a teaching episode, I don't like to call it that, more of a material to think through, I just want to share some stories, and like you and I are sitting down to have coffee somewhere and enjoying our time together. So I'm going to take you back to the beginning. We're going to start with how this all began. And I'm actually just going to read a little small portion of my Soil and Roots book. The introduction actually provides some of that context, and at least for the first part, I thought it would be helpful. So I'm just going to read a portion of that to you. Several years ago, my wife Jessica and I were forced out of a dynamic Christian nonprofit ministry that I had co-founded. So this was in 2020. No accusations or explanations were offered. We were stunned, confused, dismayed. The organization had continued successfully doing the work for which it was intended. It just continued on without us. It's common in these types of awkward situations for relationships to become strained and disappear altogether. Most of our friendships, some of which were more than 20 years old, evaporated overnight. People we had known and loved just vanished. It was like we had died. We lost our careers, we lost our calling, and we lost our community. In the blink of an eye, I had gone from a successful leader, a seasoned executive, a sought-after speaker, and a thought leader, to a disillusioned, devastated, exhausted nobody. Inevitably, the depression came when what St. John of the Cross referred to as the dark night of the soul. I basically condemned myself to a prison of isolation. What sort of Christian leader is removed from the organization he started? How could I have been so terribly disillusioned and self-deceived? I withdrew into an inner sanctum of doubt, confusion, relentless self-introspection, and a growing sense of disenchantment with the Christian institutions and systems and communities and friendships, beliefs that I held so dear. They had failed, or I had failed them. I wasn't too sure. There were nights where I couldn't sleep and days when that's all I could do. I lost weight. Jessica became concerned about my health and safety. We kept going to church, but our church was growing so fast that few people knew anyone there. It seemed the point of the church was to go to a Sunday event, sing a few songs, hear an entertaining and slightly provoking sermon, give some money, and get out as fast as you came so the next service could start. That church was far more concerned about bottoms and seats than in anyone's person journey or struggle. In fact, the traditional Christian rituals and relationships that I had relied on for so long now seemed honestly empty and shallow, maybe even fake. It wasn't just that our world had been thrown into chaos, it was that my response to that chaos didn't reflect the type of character that the Bible paints as a mature follower of Jesus. I thought I had been walking with Jesus since I was 6 years old. Where were all the abiding peace and contentment that are so often depicted as character traits of a long-term, mature follower of Christ? Surely there was more to the Christian experience than a weekly service, a routine Bible study, and volunteerism. I'd done all those things. I'd done them my entire life. Where had that gotten us? Now, I was missing something on my journey with Jesus, something deeper, something more sustaining than the practices and rituals that had held me up so far. I was still sure I was a Christian. I just wasn't sure if I was a disciple, someone who was supposed to be intimately resting in Jesus' supposedly easy yoke. Not finding any other path out of this ever-increasing darkness and depression, I finally agreed to speak with a counselor. Frankly, I wasn't very thrilled about it. Though I respected the counseling profession, I thought it was for people who rarely opened their Bibles or came from abusive homes or had serious marriage problems, and none of those described me. But about the same time, I came across a book called Renovation of the Heart by philosopher and theologian Dallas Willard. I didn't know who he was, never heard of him, but I figured if anyone's heart needed renovating, it seemed to be mine. So it began a very slow, painful, sometimes halting, yet comprehensive journey of exploration and to some degree healing. A journey with both a counselor and with what had always been a very close friend of mine, books. I started reading Willard and then ventured into dozens of other texts ranging from ancient church history, anthropology, neuroscience, philosophy, the spiritual disciplines, trauma recovery, history of Western thought, theology, cultural studies. And throughout, several questions drove me. What was the more that I was missing in my life with Jesus? And frankly, I want to know what happened to our community. Why were we deeply loved and highly valued when we were useful, popular, powerful, but rejected and abandoned as soon as our usefulness dried up? If being in a Christian community implied a steadfast commitment to each other through times of trial and despite faults or weaknesses, why had our community failed? Why had we failed? And frankly, I wanted to know if I was the only one going through this type of journey. Was there anyone else out there struggling with betrayal, abandonment, deep questions, fresh doubts, a sense that there was far more to the Christian life than a prayer of salvation and Bible studies, worship services, missions trips? Was anyone else questioning whether the way Christianity is currently manifested today in many institutions, does it actually resemble what the first Christians modeled and experienced? Was anyone else curious about whether our ideas regarding discipleship really match up with what Jesus meant when he used the term? As a way of working out these types of questions, I started a small podcast called Soil and Roots. It was and continues to be a place to explore our stories, the story of Jesus, the modern day church, and the state of our culture. As you and I, the audience, delved into deep and provocative themes and ideas related to discipleship, a few people started raising their hands, asking their own questions, and sharing their reflections. And so eventually I started the ministry, Soil and Roots. So I wrote the book in, I think it was 2020. I think I started in 21 and finished it in 22. And, you'd like to be able to say that all's well that ends well. And, 5 years later, life has miraculously changed around and there's been reformation and renewal all over the place. Well, here's what happened. So when I finished the book in 2022, I was continuing to do other work. So when we were forced out of that nonprofit in 2020, I ended up consulting for a few years in different ways. And that was fine. I never really set out to be a consultant, but pays the bills. It's good work. I just enjoy working with people long term instead of short term engagements. But in 2023, Jessica and I really felt as if the Lord was calling us to take a bit of a leap of faith, that Soil and Roots and this quest to help resolve the great mission to try to understand why so much of modern Christianity is frankly shallow and why we're not seeing deep disciples pop up in different places, that the Lord really wanted us to spend some time focused on that, and that he was inviting us to take a year off and to do nothing but Soil and Roots, more me than Jess, but that I would forego my consulting and just spend a year living off of retirement and working through Soil and Roots. And we both felt pretty strongly about it. So in September of 2023, I closed my consulting practice and we charged ahead. We basically went off income, which was very difficult. I mean, I've had a job since I was 12. I enjoy making money and earning a living. So it was a big deal. And truthfully, we sort of assumed that somewhere during that year, God would show up and validate that leap. The organization that I was thrown out of in 2020 started in a similar way. I started as a part-time volunteer gig, and a few years in, God provided several $1 million to the nonprofit to become a national organization, and it did, and it took off, and it grew and grew and grew. It was a great story of God's faithfulness and the growth of a cool ministry. So when Soil and Roots became full-time volunteerism for me, I assumed that it was going to be another romantic story of God showing up in a big way and providing the funds we needed to eventually become a full-time job. And he brought people. Tim and Kyle both have a deep desire to work with Soil and Roots on a much more robust basis. And there's a handful of others. There's probably 8 or 9 people today who have raised their hands and said, not only do we want to be a part of it, we want to be a part of it. We want to come work for it. So that was my impression going in. That was September of 2023. In October, a month later, I get sick. And I get really sick. I've shared a little bit about the illness with you, but in October, I started having very bizarre episodic symptoms across various parts of my person. And at first there was once a week or so, and then it became twice a week. Well, by Christmas, I was a mess. Matter of fact, I spent Christmas of 2023 in bed, basically incapable of doing anything. So my wife and sons were out opening gifts and calling family, and I'm laying in bed wondering what in the world is wrong with me. By January, I was basically homebound. I think I left the house maybe a half dozen times in the first 6 months of 2024. And I won't go into describing the symptoms because I don't want to trigger any of you that might be dealing with your own situations. But I logged 41 different symptoms of this disease in the first year that I was dealing with it. And so I told you before, I contracted what's called Lyme disease and 2 other infections, Bartonella and Babesia. Usually they come as a party of more than one. But the challenge with Lyme is that if you don't diagnose it and catch it in the first couple months, it goes chronic. And once it goes chronic, it goes crazy. So Lyme disease is, I think, the fastest growing disease in the United States. And so it's becoming a bigger deal now, and people are starting to pay attention to it. But it's very hard to diagnose. It's very hard to test for. And frankly, when it goes chronic, it's extremely hard to treat. In my case, I started going to doctors in October of 23, but I went through 6 months of doctors not having a clue what it was. And I went through, every test you can imagine, scans, MRIs, rounds and rounds and rounds of blood work, all sorts of stuff, with all sorts of doctors shrugging. And I finally went to what's known as a functional doctor, which is a kind of a different branch of medicine. She was an MD, but she practiced functional medicine. And she did very deep and involved blood work, and it finally came back that I had Lyme disease and these 2 other co-infections. So by mid-24, I at least had a diagnosis, but the doctor was very clear that this is not something you take some antibiotics and get over in 6 weeks or 2 weeks or a week. The recovery period for chronic Lyme is measured in years. So that was not the way that I thought the story was supposed to be written, as you can imagine. I had responded to God's call, and instead of blessing and growth, I become very seriously ill with a prognosis that suggests that it's going to be years of recovery to get back to some sort of functioning health. And so 2024, to be blunt, is a year that I strongly wish to forget, just like I would prefer to forget 2020, as I'm sure many of you would prefer to forget. And so the other challenge, of course, is I was off income. I had no job, so we had no health insurance. And I belong to one of those goofy Christian health share things, which, to be honest, don't do much. But I had to pay 100% of the expenses for treatment and all the testing out of pocket. And I think the average for somebody that has chronic Lyme over their lifetime, they'll spend $150,000 trying to treat this disease. That's how crazy it is. So we're not at that point, but we're tens of thousands of dollars out of pocket to try to get me back to some form of health, and all the bills before that trying to diagnose it. So anyway, this just wasn't, the story was not being written the way that it was supposed to be written. We experienced all the devastation of 2020. We finally get ourselves back into some sort of stable footing. And then I become ill with a very serious disease. So, as you might imagine, as 2024 wraps into 2025 and the days are turning into weeks, the weeks are turning into months, God, what are you doing? Like, what in the world is going on here? Did I not hear you? Did my wife not hear you? Is this not what you want us to do? Do you want us to stay with this Sorrel and Roots thing? Isn't this supposed to grow? Like, where's the money? So, there's much more to it. I won't bore you with the details, but it's now mid 2026, and I'm happy to report that I'm about 85 to 90% better. Those 41 symptoms are down to 3 or 4. I still have good days and bad days. I don't have the energy and stamina that I should. I still can't fly. There's some things that I can't do. But in terms of functionality, I'm leading much more of a quiet life. But in relation to Sorrel and Roots, there was still the question of, at some point, it would be good to have some clarification that this is still where you want me, because a year of obedience and financially living on our own is one thing, but it's now turned into 3 years, and that's a whole different story. And then you throw all the expenses of healthcare on top of it. But Jessica and I decided, just look, sometimes obedience hurts and sometimes it's uncomfortable, and we still feel as if this is where God has us, and he has a desire to invite all of us into a deeper, more intimate relationship with him and to understand the framework in which that happens. And so in April, just a couple months ago, I asked a few friends to join me in what I call the 14-day prayer sprint. This was right before Easter, during Lent. And so Tim and Kyle, who you obviously know, were part of that. And then a new friend, Dave, who you actually meet in the next episode. And then another gentleman from Fort Worth. We would meet every evening for an hour for that 14-day period to pray for 5 things, specifically for Sorrel and Roots and for this quest into spiritual formation and deeper discipleship. And the 5 things were that God would be kind enough to reveal some of his hidden thoughts and his heart for deep discipleship and for people experiencing Jesus in more profound ways. The second thing was just clarity. Hey, you still want us to do this? You've given us this passion and this calling, but we're all volunteer, and we continue to have individual challenges. Is this still where you want us? So clarity. The 3 was just financial provision, to convert this into a full-time effort to spread deep discipleship and opportunities through our greenhouse model, which I'll talk about here down the road. It can't be done as a volunteer basis. We've had lots of people reach out to us saying, hey, we want to start greenhouses. We want to start these ecosystems that you've developed to become more like Jesus. And we said, hey, that's great, but we just don't have the support structure to be able to help them. Do you still want us to do this? Where can you send some checks our way, some larger checks to be able to go full time and to do this work? And the 4th thing was just protection from spiritual warfare. and forces that would look to thwart us. And the fifth thing is connectedness. Could we find other folks who resonate with Dallas Willard's conclusion that we're suffering from a great omission, that we're just not experiencing the abundant life, the with God life that God desires for us? And could we find some other people who are resonating with that we might be able to connect with? So it was that God would share his hidden thoughts for clarity, for financial resources, for protection and insight into the spiritual forces, and connectedness to other folks. We spent 14 days praying through those things, and it was amazing. It was a time of just quiet presence before Jesus and a sense of gentleness, of community between the five of us that were praying. And just a really sweet, that was a great way to ramp up the Easter for me this year in 2026. And so once we finished those things, we just sat back and said, well, let's see what the Lord does. And so as I close down this section, and we'll move on to the Sorrel and Root story next, sometimes obedience feels less like a heroic leap and more like just taking the next small step when, we're tired and confused, and in my case, ill, and just not really sure what God is doing. And so I just wanted to share a few minutes on my personal story so you understood the backdrop of why we're doing the podcast and the Substack articles and the greenhouses. It is born out of 5.5 years of difficulty. Jessica and I are empty nesters now, and we're supposed to be traveling and going out to eat and enjoying life, and I'm supposed to be in my peak earning years, and that's just not the story that God has written. Instead, it's been a real trying time. Lots of blessings, and frankly, I'm at the point now where I am most days grateful for all the events of 2020 and frankly for the illness, but that's a process that takes a long time to get to. And I'm glad to be where we are. So thanks for listening to that part. We're going to take a short music break and just grab our breath. And then I want to share a bit of the 5-year history of Sorrel and Root specifically. So stay tuned. Okay, welcome back. So I just want to share some of the 5-year history of Sorrel and Roots so that you have a great context for the next two sections, which is what is God doing this summer in 2026, and then what do we expect and hope to happen as we head into the fall related to deep discipleship. And I hope that this relates to you and your journey as well. So I mentioned in the last section that Dallas Willard was a person I'd never heard of. And if you've listened to the podcast, you now know he's been very influential to me over the last 5 years, his writings. And I think he's actually becoming more known and influential since his death. He died in 2013. That's a sign of a pretty remarkable person when they have more impact in death than they did in life. But anyway, I've been following Jesus since I was 6. I've been in Protestant churches my whole life. I'd never heard of the guy. And I don't even remember how I came across the book. This was probably in 2020, 2021. But somewhere I saw The Renovation of the Heart, and I read it. And there was one particular passage which just struck me. It struck me this way. It may not strike you this way, but I'm going to read you a portion of it because I thought it was mind-blowing. Again, I'm a mess mentally and spiritually when I'm reading this, but I found this to be really profound. So on page 96, if you happen to have a copy, Willard writes about ideas. Ideas are very general models of our assumption about reality. They're patterns of interpretation, historically developed and socially shared. They sometimes are involved with beliefs, but are much more than belief and do not depend on belief. Whoa. They are ways of thinking about and interpreting things. They are so pervasive and essential to how we think about and how we approach life that we often do not even know they are there or understand when and how they're at work. Our idea systems are cultural artifacts, growing up with us from earliest childhood and out of the teaching, expectations, and observable behaviors of family and community. Examples of ideas: freedom, education, happiness, the American dream, science, progress, death, home, feminine or masculine, the religious, Christian, Muslim, church, democratic, fair, just, family, evolution, God, and so on. Okay, let me skip down. Now, for all their importance to human life, ideas are never capable of definition or precise specification, and yet people never stop trying to define them in their vain efforts to control them. They're broadly inclusive, historically developing ways of interpreting things and events, which for all their power often do not emerge into the consciousness of the individual. This is partly because one commonly identifies his or her own governing ideas with reality, pure and simple, meaning the ideas that govern us, we assume are reality even if they're not reality. Ironically, it is often people who think of themselves as practical or as men of action, both, of course, major ideas, who are most in the grip of ideas. So far in that grip that they can't be bothered to think. They simply don't know what moves them, but ideas govern them and have their consequences anyway. I was blown away. This was the first time in my life that somebody had said there are forces governing me of which I'm not conscious. I was almost offended when I read it the first time. And I read through the passage over and over and over again. And I read it in the context of another one of Willard's quotes. His conclusion was that the modern church age is experiencing the great omission. I've said this 1,000 times in the podcast, that we talk about making disciples, but we're not making disciples, meaning we're not actually forming the character of people to become more like Jesus. We might be fighting over doctrine, we might be attending church, but in terms of becoming people who do the things Jesus did naturally and organically without even thinking about them, he concluded that's not happening. And so I think, well, this has to be tied into his concept of ideas. If we're actually operating from unconscious forces, if we're being powered and governed by these mysterious things called ideas, which are formed in childhood and carry throughout life, perhaps that's part of the problem. And therefore, wouldn't it make sense for a person who wishes to become deep, who wishes to become more like Jesus, to investigate these ideas? Wouldn't it make sense to try to make the unconscious conscious, to become people of depth? It was around that time that I read Richard Foster's Celebration of Disciplines, which we've talked about. But he's pretty famous for this quote about deep people. And I've said this before on the podcast. Quote, "Superficiality is the curse of our age. The doctrine of instant satisfaction is a primary spiritual problem. The desperate need today is not for a greater number of intelligent people or gifted people, but for deep people." And I think Foster's right. What the world needs most is not more government, is not more institutionalism. It's for people who are committed to becoming deep people, which is ultimately a journey of inner character formation. And that is the central premise on which Soil and Roots rests. We sit in the world of these hidden ideas and desires and say, if we want to become more like Jesus, the human person at some point needs to take an inner journey to determine what those ideas and desires actually are and see if they align up with what Jesus is doing. Because if we want to become more like him, we need to become more like him, not only in our conscious ways, but also in our unconscious ways. I know it's a lot of philosophy, but hang in there with me. So I began pairing Willard, Foster together, and that's where we came up with this definition of what is a deep people. If deep people are what is most needed, what does that mean? And so I've defined it here as somebody who is increasingly attuned to God, others, themselves, and creation at the heart level, that we are increasingly becoming more like Jesus from the inside out. And I think that requires exploring what Psalms and other places in the Bible refer to as our innermost being or our hidden parts. And what I'm saying is that is rarely done in modern Christianity. About the only places you're going to find it are in recovery groups or maybe counseling, when in fact, in my view, it should be mainstream. So the underpinning of Soil and Roots, the assumptions, are that every human being on the planet is functioning from hidden ideas and desires. If we want to become more like Jesus, we need to at some point take a journey to uncover those desires and those ideas. And I understand that this is a very different, sometimes controversial way of looking at discipleship. especially in an age of such intellectualism. But over the last 5 years, this has been validated time and time and time again in our own greenhouse beta, in the discussions that I've had with different pastors and leaders all over the country, really, that there's a desperate need for deep people, and that must involve some sort of a journey inward. So you might recognize that term because I've used it before. I'm pulling from a book called The Critical Journey, which was written 30 or 40 years ago now by Hagberg and I think it's Gulich. And look, it's theory. It's not theological doctrine. They theorize that the spiritual journey can be broken down into 6 stages. Stage 1 is being introduced to God, evangelism, or just sort of waking up to the reality of God. Stage 2, I call education, learning more about God, learning more about Christianity, learning more about church. Stage 3 is basically service, getting plugged into a church or some sort of parachurch effort and volunteering, doing service. Those 3, the book claims, are what the modern church institution is awesome at. They're very good at introducing people to God. They're very good at educating us about God. And they're very good about plugging us into their systems to be able to serve. And that's all great. It's tremendous. But the authors go on to point that the latter stages 4, 5, and 6, are where that depth is achieved. Achieves the wrong word. Where that depth is experienced, or where it's discovered. Stage 4 is called the journey inward, the inner journey. And it always involves what they call a wall. The wall is a time in our lives where we sort of smack up against reality, and it might be a divorce. It might be, like in my case, massive career upheaval and community evaporation. It could be a health diagnosis. It could be a relationship battle. It could just be theological doubts, like, oh, I'm sure this is true, and then, oh, I'm not so sure that's true. So the wall can take a lot of forms. But what it is a time of, I use this word carefully, but deconstruction. Where we're forced to say, are the things we believe actually the things we believe? Meaning, okay, I believe them with my head, but does my heart believe those? And I'm not sure we become deep disciples without moving through the wall. And most people, and the book claims this, when they hit the wall, because we all face the wall at some point, usually bounce off. We go back into the earlier stages because it's safer, or we numb ourselves so that we don't have to deal with the eventual pain and struggle that comes with the wall. If we can press through the wall, through that 4th stage, then the journey outward means that our hearts become less and less about ourselves, not in a bad way, not in self-deprecation, but that we just begin to turn more outward and become more service-oriented beautifully and organically, eventually leading to stage 6, which is a life of love, which is really the life of Jesus. So if we stick all this together, okay, hang with me. If we stick all this together, you could position the great omission as a lack of opportunity for you and I to engage in stages 4, 5, and 6, because we are in institutions that don't work in stages 4, 5, and 6. The institutions we're a part of are 1, 2, and 3. And so when we inevitably hit the wall, we have very few options in terms of what do we do with this? If I express my theological doubts at church, I'm probably going to get kicked out of church. Maybe not. Or if I confess some of the hidden ideas and desires now I'm bumping up against, people are going to hate me, or they're going to judge me. Like, this is real. We hear from people all the time that have these experiences. So what is evolving really with Soil and Roots is that Soil and Roots is a bridge, is the pathway through stage 4 in the wall. I think God has developed, really without me knowing it, the elements necessary or best to help somebody who is facing the wall and going through some of that tumult to be gently and safely guided through that stage 4 into those later stages. Now, the book will say the stages aren't linear. We bounce in and around. Sometimes you can be at 2 at once. So I don't want to set this up like just do X and Y is going to happen. But I do think that what God has called us to is providing safe guided passage into and through stage 4 into the deeper stages of life. And so it helps resolve the great omission. That inner character formation, which has to involve self-knowledge, a deepening self-knowledge and knowledge of God, in an ecosystem that allows us to explore those things and wrestle with those things in a way that we come out the other side as less angry, less anxious, more forgiving, more generous, more like Jesus, more relationally secure. I'm reminded of the Tozer quote, which you can obviously see there's been a series of quotes, which has been very important. A.W. Tozer said that our idea of God, our hidden assumptions about God, that our ideas of God correspond as nearly as possible to the true being of God are of immense importance to us. Compared with our actual thoughts about him, our creedal statements, our belief statements, are of little consequence. Our real idea of God may lay buried under the rubbish of conventional religious notion and might require an intelligent and vigorous search before it's finally unearthed and exposed for what it is. Only after an ordeal of painful self-probing are we likely to discover what we actually believe about God. End quote. Okay, so this is not about endless self-analysis. It's not about navel-gazing, but if you put all this together, if you put Willard's great omission and the existence of these hidden ideas and desires that are driving us, and that we become deep people more like Jesus by exploring those hidden ideas and desires and seeing if they align with God or not. But that painful self-probing is a necessary part of depth, and it's missing in the modern church ecosystem. We now see why Soul and Roots is so essential. How does that happen? How do we move from the safer, institutionalized, and again, there's benefits to that, stages into these more wild, more surrendering stages 4, 5, and 6 in a way that gently moves us to be more like Jesus? And the traditional answers would be sermons, private prayer time, private devotions, and those things are all good. But I'm going to bring us back to a C.S. Lewis quote that has really stuck with me. Here's what he said. Quote, God works on us in all sorts of ways, not only through what we think our religious life. He works through nature, through our own bodies, through books, sometimes through experiences which seem at the time anti-Christian. When a young man who has been going to church in a routine way honestly realizes that he does not believe in Christianity and stops going, providing he does it for honesty's sake and not just to tick off his parents, the Spirit of Christ is probably nearer to him then than it ever was before. Here's the key point. But above all, God works on us through each other. Okay. Through each other. And this is not just sitting with people in a church service on Sunday. What Lewis is getting at, and what I agree with, is that this refining process, this painful self-probing, this moving through the wall into the deeper stages of discipleship with Jesus and becoming more like him, is best taken with people with whom we can be very raw and vulnerable in a safe, non-judgmental environment that allows us to wrestle with these things. And that was the impetus for starting the greenhouse. Now, if you're not familiar with the greenhouse model, it's in previous episodes, but basically it's a group of 4 to 12 people who meet weekly now, who are coming together with the intentional purpose of becoming more like Jesus. And we're engaging in dialogue and spiritual disciplines and activities that are not the traditional Western things. They're not like crazy either, but like soul care. Like we practice soul care. How's it going with your soul? How are you really? Don't give me the surface statements and say, I'm fine. How are you really? What's going on in your heart? What's going on with Jesus? The point is the inward journey, this stage 4, this wall, this passing from a surface Christianity to deep discipleship is best taken with other people. But that needs to be done in an environment that is safe and guided and gentle, and not in a way that is going to promote rejection or judgmentalism. Now, again, I'm not winking at our sinful behaviors here. That's not what I'm doing. I'm simply saying that in many cases, we lack the ecosystem in which stage 4 best happens, and we don't have the spiritual friends that we need to help us guide us through the wall. It's just difficult. So safe, patient people who we can be raw with and who can certainly challenge us and encourage us. But as I've said many times, the most important thing is that are with us. People that are with us. if I were to go back to my own story in 2020, the depths of my heartbreak was not getting forced out of my own organization. It was the fact that so many people that I thought were friends that were journeying with me stopped because things didn't go the way they wanted. Because all of a sudden I was persona non grata. And I felt that at a very, very deep level. It seemed to me as if I was going through a crisis, shouldn't that be the time when those around me who claimed to be friends would come closer? That actually is the way that I've tried to, Jessica and I both have tried to practice that over the years. We haven't always been successful. Shouldn't that be a time where those that call me friend draw in and say, we're going to be with you. We're going to sit with you. Not going to give you advice, not going to tell you what to do. We're just going to sit with you. And that presence itself is going to be healing. And that's what I think needs to be resurrected in the modern church in small groups. And that's the ethos of what a greenhouse is. Okay, last point on this section, the soil and roots story over the last 5 years. We just like last week, wrapped up a spiritual formation survey. So we have about 100,000 subscribers on Substack all over the world. And usually on any given week, when I send out an email, 20,000 people read it, which is, it's pretty good. It's decent. But that's a pretty nice cross section. And so we sent out a spiritual formation survey to that whole body of people all over the world and said, look, how's it going? How's your journey with Jesus? How are your feelings about the modern church? Are you spiritually exhausted? Are you good? Are you attuning to Jesus? Do you sense his delight in you? Or is it more surface level and you're just kind of do the stuff that you're supposed to do? And it was great. I'm going to share some of the higher level responses on Substack coming up here in the next month or so. But I wanted to read one comment. It was anonymous, so obviously I don't know who it was, but I thought it sort of typified the person who is at stage 4 and facing a wall and what they're dealing with and why I'm so compelled to continue on with Soil and Roots. This is what the person said, quote, "The church I go to on Sundays is a big church. The place I met Jesus, though, was a house church, and you can feel the Holy Spirit as soon as you walk in the door. I believe these small gatherings will be a refuge for people of all walks of life. The modern church culture makes it very difficult for people to be open and honest because people are so busy trying to look like they have it all together. I think what Christians are really missing today is transparency and realness. I know this, yet I'm caught in the same trap. We're dying, we're broken, we're depressed, we're dead inside, yet we're smiling and singing and laughing like we don't have a care in the world. And if we're honest about our struggles, we're talked about and we're judged. We have to change this," unquote. So I very much appreciate whoever sent this in on the survey, and we had numerous other comments like this. And that is exactly, I think, the burden that I feel because I've lived it in very visceral ways. My wife has lived it. Others of you have shared in your own stories how you've lived it, this sense of deep loneliness and deep disconnection. And at times where life comes in on us, not having a safe place to walk through the wall together. And that's the burden that has been driving what we're doing. So to sum up, Soil and Roots is based on the premise that the human person functions from hidden ideas and desires that we can go entire lifetimes and not be conscious of and not explore. And yet if we want to become people of depth, which Foster said is the most dire need in the world, we must become conscious of the unconscious. The best place to do that is in safe ecosystems where that's the point. Not forever, for a period of time, so that we pass through that stage 4 and wall together, not alone, as we seek to become more like Jesus and more loving. That's the work that I think Soil and Roots has been entrusted to, and we've been exploring for the last 5 years. How do we become deep people in these trusted communities from the inside out? Okay, that wraps up the second section. We'll take a brief music break, and then we'll talk about what's going on this summer. Okay, I warned you this was going to be long, so forgiveness requested. Just put it on pause and come back. But I want to share with you some of what's happened since April. I left the personal story in April of this year, 2026, when we finished our 14-day prayer sprint and the 5 things that we prayed for. Well, the Lord has answered some of those prayers in really awesome ways. One of the primary things that we've learned is that the Soil and Roots community, which is the beta greenhouse we've been meeting for the last 3 years, a group of people who are becoming together to become more like Jesus. We just finished our 3rd year. The podcast, of course, which is now 144 episodes, and I have no idea how many people, it's hard to tell, but folks listen to it or watch it in different parts of the world, and then Substack. Those are our primary ways of exploring deep discipleship and how we become more like Jesus from the inside out. And I'll have to say, Soil and Roots is still very small. The idea of it started in 2021. The podcast started in 2022. The organization started in 2023. And we're still, by all intents and purposes, tiny. We're all volunteer. No one's ever taken a paycheck. We've hired some contract labor for some things, but I'm still remain a full-time volunteer. Kyle, Tim, all those folks are still volunteering. But when people engage with us, it's very deep. Like the questions we get and the stories that we hear, as I've just shared with you, are substantial. So we have seen folks be really committed. When somebody gets into the podcast, they stick with it. Some of you binge listen, which is crazy, but God bless you, and are burning through episodes faster than I could put them out. And others of you take your time and move through pieces and parts, which is great too. So it's not casual consumption of the material. You are allowing yourselves to begin to explore the depths of your heart and the heart of God too, in what I think are some unique ways. And that's been great. So we've had a lot of good fruit. We've had some wonderful engagement. We've had the beta greenhouse. We have good audience in Substack. We have an audience on the podcast. But I did want to figure out why it wasn't growing more. Like, are we missing something? Am I not communicating properly? What was I doing wrong? Or frankly, did not enough people really care? Willard sort of concluded that maybe we didn't really want to become deep disciples. Maybe that wasn't our yearning in too many people's hearts. I'm probably a little bit more optimistic. But you have reported to us that you're beginning to uncover hidden ideas. You're becoming more honest and raw in your relationship with Jesus and yourself. You're sharing some amazing stories. You're certainly growing in self-awareness. So I asked my buddy, Zach Layton, who's been on the podcast. He runs an agency up in Idaho who helps Christian ministries message and communicate better to people. And so I said, hey, man, can you just take a look at the last 5 years worth of content and exploration? Are we not resonating? Like, what's going on? And he ran a bunch of fancy dancy tests, and the reports came back from him and another place, and they said the same thing. No, the Soil and Roots messaging and the content of what you're exploring is great. People are into it. It's a different way of looking at discipleship. It's non-traditional, but in a good way. It's provocative. It's helpful. But the way, Brian, that you have titled and set your stuff up on the internet makes it non-discoverable. Meaning, if you were to look at the way that I was titling the episodes, I was trying to be creative. Pop culture references or song titles, because I get bored of just straight-laced stuff. And this is, the Soil and Roots material is deep and sometimes difficult. It's not a comedy show, although I like to laugh. Maybe you wouldn't know it by listening to the podcast. But I made massive mistakes on how I titled my Substack articles and the podcast episodes, and Google can't find it, basically. So if someone is searching for, is there more to the Christian life or deep discipleship, or how is my inner life formed, Soil and Roots doesn't even pop up because I messed up the way that things should be written and some of the technical stuff behind the scenes. So it's a bit frustrating, especially for me being a performance-oriented guy. I didn't know, but it wasn't like I couldn't have found out. I just didn't think that far ahead. And so one of the major projects that I'm doing this summer, is basically cleaning up all the episodes and all the Substack articles and the website. Those are the 3 major pieces, and making them discoverable so people can find what we're talking about. And that's a massive project, and I'm trying to get through it as fast as I can, but at the same time, trying to be careful. So I don't know why you would care, but if you were to go back and look at like Spotify and the episode titles, they've all changed. They're all more searchable. And some of the stuff, the technical stuff behind the scenes, I'm cleaning up. So that's a primary challenge. It's not that people aren't interested, it's that they can't find us. And so hopefully by the end of the summer, people will be able to find us and there'll be some greater fruit and some greater engagement. But secondly, I was looking for some fresh voices to help me review the last 5 years and kind of figure out what the next season of Soil and Roots is going to look like. And that's been terrific. So God very graciously, again, post-April, our prayer time, brought 3 individuals, new folks, into the Soil and Roots orbit who have become deeply passionate. And they're older than I am and wiser than I am, and they know their way around. And so we're meeting weekly. You're going to meet 2 of them on the next episode. I'm inviting them to come into the greenhouse episode for 145. And so we're meeting and we're reviewing all that we've worked on in the last 5 years, and we're planning the next version, the next season of Soil and Roots, and it is super exciting. So there's a lot going on behind the scenes. I'm not going to bore you with all the details, but I do want to lay out what the fall will look like and how we're changing and updating the greenhouse model and where Soil and Roots is headed. So this summer is not at all a pause for us. I know it is for much of life, but we're meeting and writing and praying and studying and redoing and reorganizing. And I think the next season of Soil and Roots is going to be super exciting. So we'll pause here, take a breath, and then I'll share with you what's coming up in the fall of 2026. Okay, so we've covered a little bit of my personal story and Jessica's story with mine together, because we're together. And then we've talked about the key elements of Soil and Roots, the organization, and the pathway into deep discipleship. And then I've just shared a little bit about what's happening in this summer, fixing all the internet stuff that I screwed up and making us searchable and discoverable, and reviewing the last 5 years and starting to plan for what's ahead. So the last 3 years, we've been beta testing the greenhouse. Again, the greenhouse is the primary mechanism that we have been testing, where a person can come in, explore these hidden ideas and desires in a place that is designed for those to be wrestled with Jesus, in the hopes that we come out more like Jesus by the time we're done. So we have spent 3 years with a wonderful group of people. I did sense by mid-April that season was ending for that particular beta test, that we had learned what we needed to learn and experienced things and heard the testimony of people in it and how the Lord had changed them and how they were becoming more aware of themselves and of God, all the things that you sort of hope would happen were happening. But that it was time to assess that and figure out, well, how does this happen going forward? And so the way that was structured, we practiced 4 different rhythms. We originally met twice a week, and then we went to once a week. And they were good, but it wasn't necessarily organized in a specific framework. And there were questions about, well, what is a greenhouse? My wife named it, which I love, several years ago when we were first building the guts of Soil and Roots. It's so Soil and Roots-ish. But a greenhouse is a safe place where you grow, right? Come together to be rooted and grown in Jesus. It's a brilliant term. But, the obvious challenge is that immediately you and I are going to say, oh, we're going to categorize it. That's a small group. That's a Bible study. That's a Sunday school. Well, it actually isn't any of those things, but it's hard to introduce a new term into modern life and actually, make it stick. So, and is it a home church? Like I didn't know if God was sort of moving us to start a home church network. So where we've landed, and this is hot off the press, is that a greenhouse, the next version of it, are going to be 2-year small communities that are going to be walking together through a specific guided framework into deep discipleship. It's not a church. It's not a small group. It's not a Bible study either. It's a greenhouse. It's a place where we're coming together with very specific rhythms and an atmosphere so these things can be explored. Basically, it's a 2-year structured pathway through the stage 4, through the inward journey. And so therefore it's not for everybody, obviously, because people are at different stages of their development. But for those that are feeling some inner sense of deconstruction or unrest or doubts or are experiencing the wall physically, right, or career-wise or relationally, that's what it's designed for. But we're time boxing it to 2 years for a couple different reasons. One is it just feels like that's the right amount of time where trust can be really built and good, solid, healthy, intimate relationships can be built. And it's probably enough time to spend time looking at Jesus that way and also exploring our stories and in our inward journeys. Because you don't want to get stuck in stage 4. It's not competing with the church. Churches can do greenhouses. Parachurches can do greenhouses. If somebody is not in a church, they can form a greenhouse. It's fine. At the end of that 2-year period, if a greenhouse wants to stay together and continue to be a community, awesome. We're going to support that and we'll figure out what that looks like. If other greenhouses want to spawn out of that, the greenhouse is, I don't want to say led, but helped, guided by a facilitator. That's a key role. It's the person who is facilitating the discussions and the pathway and making sure that everybody's being heard, asking curious questions, practicing a Socratic method versus a scholastic method, meaning more questions and listening than just blurting out information. And so perhaps there's folks that are going through the 2 years of the greenhouse experience who feel called that they should become a facilitator. So the greenhouse may spawn other greenhouses. Or if the greenhouse is done and people want to do other things, then they're done. The 2-year experience is over. So we're leaving that very open-handed. But instead of just saying, oh, this is a home church, which it isn't, it's a 2-year guided journey into stage 4, into deep discipleship with 4 to 12 people, guided by a facilitator. I love it. It's not where I thought it was going when Soil and Roots first started testing the greenhouse, but I think it's right. And what was super cool about the last few months is I had to step back and take a look at the last 5 years of content and realize that that's actually what God was developing. It didn't come out in order. Like if you listen to the whole podcast chain, it's you're seeing me wrestling and exploring with these things in the way that I did. But listening chronologically, which we've encouraged people to do and is good, is not necessarily the best to accomplish in a 2-year community. But the raw elements were all there. I've been working on what's known as a theory of change, which is how does a person's heart actually become more like Jesus? And all the elements were stuck in the content that I had developed and that Tim has developed. We're working on, what happens in the greenhouse over that 2-year period? Like what are we going to practice? What needs to be covered? What needs to be explored? How does it stay safe and gentle, but still moves us through stage 4 on the wall together? And most of the elements are there. They were hidden in the content that was already developed. It's such a cool story. And so what we're doing as we're heading into, this is mid-June, we have finished the theory of change, meaning how does a person become more like Jesus from the inside out? And we're now building, what does that 2-year journey look like? And again, those elements exist. We're just reordering them and putting them in a way that makes sense. And it's been amazing. But the role of the facilitator is essential, right? And the facilitator is kind of a unique bird in modern Christianity because we don't necessarily have the best example. It's not a teaching pastor. It's actually somebody who needs to be a really good listener, like a super good listener, and is okay not teaching, which is difficult. And somebody who is really attuned to God, but really self-knowledgeable, like dialed into their own hearts pretty well. And God has brought these advisors, and one of them, David, who you'll meet next week, has been around a long time. He's a professional coach, Christian coach. Like that's what he does. He facilitates. And so God raised him up out of the blue. He heard a podcast episode 5 or 6 months ago and called me up, and we become good friends. And now he's involved with Soil and Roots. He's actually helping to construct the training and the support for facilitators, because I think as a facilitator goes, so will each of these greenhouses. And so that's in motion. There's a lot of balls in the air. And so what's going to happen is, as we head into the fall, we hope that the beta greenhouse that we ran for 3 years, that's retiring, that maybe we'll have a few more of these new greenhouse models bubble up. And I think that's going to happen. and build the training for the facilitators and begin moving into this brand new framework, this guided pathway through stage 4 and through the wall in a way that's really unique. And I think very Jesus centric. And I think it's going to be amazing. It's not the be all end all. Sometimes I get asked if I think that, the institutional church is bad or the small groups are bad. Look, you know that I'm a critic, not that I always want to be, but that I'm critical of modern Christianity in many ways. But I think there's tremendous value and a lot of good in those institutions that help us with stage 1, 2, and 3. My heart, though, is for the person who is facing the wall, because I've been there, I've lived it, and most of you, if not all of you, have lived it. I'll share more with you, I think, as we head into the rest of the summer, but I just wanted you to hear from me where things are, where I am, and where things are. And so if you're like, well, gosh, what are the next steps? If you have an interest in a greenhouse or facilitator, reach out. I've said my email address a million times, fish@soilandroots.org. I don't know what all is going to happen as we head into the fall. I don't know how many greenhouses we're going to have, where they are, how they're going to be structured yet. Some of that's being worked out. But if you feel Jesus' tug to either help facilitate a greenhouse, or you're like, hey man, I want to be a part of a greenhouse, just reach out to me and let me know. There's always prayer requests. As I said, Jessica and I are on this journey that we thought was going to be a year and is now 3 years. And so we are still praying we've been upfront for financial abundance. I absolutely feel called to be full-time in this. There's several other people that feel the same call. For those of you that are donating, I cannot tell you how important that's been. Although nobody's getting paid, your donations have covered the expenses, which for even a small ministry are pretty substantial. So thank you for your financial support. We are asking for that to increase by people that might be called to help us build this. I don't know where that's going to go. We'll just have to see. So you can certainly pray for that. Pray that we continue to have connections. Pray that the material becomes discoverable and that it serves other people. Those would all be great things to pray for. So I've shared a lot, and thanks for sticking with me for over an hour, but I hope this has been helpful. I just wanted to share my heart, and maybe it's been a little bit of a brain dump, but I hope you've followed it and it makes sense to you. 5 years in, we're a little tired. We're a little bruised, but at the same time, we are super grateful for you, super grateful for Jesus and for the journey into depth that we're all on. And we're not there yet, but we're on it together. And we just desperately want you to experience him in new and fresh ways and deeper ways, the way that he's invited us into. So thanks for walking with us. Thanks for listening and praying and sharing the podcast and 5-star reviewing it and for commenting on Substack. It's just been terrific. And I'm glad you're with us. If you want more information on Soil and Roots, you probably know the drill. Check us out at soilandroots.org, which is becoming increasingly discoverable. You can reach us out to us or read my articles over on Substack. Just search for Soil and Roots, and we have all the social stuff that we've talked about ad nauseum here. But really, if we can serve you in some way, or if you're feeling a pull to engage more deeply, just email me, fish@soilandroots.org. You can also reach out to Kyle at soilandroots.org. He's helping a ton on helping these greenhouses get mobilized. And we can't wait to share more about that with you as we head through the summer. Last thing, episode 145, which I'm going to try to record next week. I'm bringing 2 individuals from this advisory group on. David Smith is a gentleman I mentioned from Redding, California, who is helping a ton on the facilitator side. And then Rhonda Jenkins, who I can't wait for you to meet. She was my spiritual director for 2 years, and God really moved on her heart. And I totally affirmed it for her to be involved here. And so she has moved over to contribute and help with Soil and Roots. And they are 2 saints. And I want to hear their stories. I want them to share their stories with you. And I want you to hear why they're involved in deep discipleship efforts and how that's happening. And we're going to have a lovely discussion. So that'll be episode 145. All right. Thanks so much. We'll see you next time.